So a quick summary of what we have done so far. In the first video, we answered the question, what is economic growth? Okay, that was the first video. Then in the second video, we went ahead and asked, what does economic growth depend on? Okay, that was in the previous video, and the answer that we arrived at was that economic growth depends on two things. One was the the size of the workforce, and let's go up and see where we saw them. Right here, the aggregate workforce or the aggregate labor market and the aggregate production function. So one was the production function and two was the labor market. Now we need to ask a third important question, is that how does economic growth take place? This is an important question to ask. So notice we started with what is economic growth, and then we answered what does it depend on, and now we're going to ask how does it happen. Okay. So before we move on to that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take these two diagrams that we've seen so far, the production function and the labor market, and I'm going to put them together. Okay, this is interesting. So let's start with the production function. So we have hours worked here, and we have output, real output, or let's say real GDP. And this is what we get. This is our production function. Just underneath this, I'm going to draw the labor market. So notice that the x-axis are the same. We have hours worked here as well, but on the y-axis we have real wage. And what we saw was that this was labor demand, downward sloping as always. This was labor supply, upward sloping as always, and this was the equilibrium. Okay, so this is real wage, let's call it W0, and over here we have hours worked. It's actually labor hours worked. So let's call this L0, and we can call this anything we want. And if I extend it up, over here we have L0, which remember we had defined previously as the full employment quantity of labor. This is where we have full employment. And over here what we have is potential GDP. So this is the connection between production function and the labor market. See, because we have the same thing in the x-axis, which is labor hours worked, we can directly compare the two diagrams, and what we see is that when we have L0 hours of labor being used in the economy with a wage of W0, the production, the output in the economy is this much. which is our potential. Okay. So now once we know how to combine these two diagrams, we can ask this question: how does economic growth take place? Okay, and there are two ways in which economic growth takes place. One happens when there is a rise in in the labor supply. So how might the labor supply increase? Or by labor supply I mean labor supplied to the market. How might that increase? So one way is, of course, to think that population increase. Usually this is a slow process. Population growth of a country is somewhere between 1 and 2% or less, usually not more than that. This is a slow, gradual process, but it may speed up if we get a very high number of immigrants coming into the country. But even then, I mean, it's unlikely that population growth is going to be 5%, 6-7%. Doesn't really happen. The second way in which labor supply can increase is through average hours worked. So on average, if everyone who has a job was working for 8 hours and then average goes up to 9 hours, that would mean that the labor supplied to the market has gone up, even though number of workers has not increased, but the quantity of labor that is available in the market has gone up. So this is the second way in which it can happen. I might say even this is quite rare, doesn't happen that often. In fact, because of automation and more machines coming in, for better labor laws as well, what we see is that average hours is actually falling in most parts of the country. Now the standard work day is 8 hours a day, 5 days, maybe at most 6 days a week. That's the standard that we have, and you guys of course know historically it used to be much higher. So even though average hours worked can increase the labor supply to the market, it's not the trend that we have been experiencing, although this may happen in the short run, like for a period of time, for whatever reason. More people are searching for a job. This can be a few weeks or a few months, a year that we experience this. And the third reason why the labor supplied to the market may go up is if the employee to population, or actually I'm going to write it in a different way. What I'm going to say is that the labor participation rate. Okay, what does this mean? If you guys would remember from the second chapter we did, that there is a working age population, and not everyone from that working age population is employed. Some people are searching for jobs but they can't find jobs. Other people are not interested in working, they're not looking for jobs. But if that were to change and suddenly more people started looking for jobs, then that would also mean that the labor supply to the market has gone up. And this is something that we see has been increasing in recent history. Think of women's emancipation. More women are working today than 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, as far back as you can go. The trend has been that over time, more and more women has entered the workforce. So labor participation rate has gone up. We also see, because of rise in technology, consulting works have gone up. The gig economy has gone up. So even in Bangladesh, we see a lot of people delivering foods and other goods, for example. So these are examples of the gig economy. And these two factors, women entry in the job market and the gig economy that we have experienced in the last 5-10 years, have led to a pretty significant rise in the labor force participation rate, and that is something that has significantly increased the labor supply to the market. So effectively, these are the three ways in which labor supply in the market can increase, but remember, this is slow. This is not what we observe, so trend is opposite. Actually, we see that average work hours are falling, and this is something that has happened. Okay, so anyways, whichever is more important, the fact is these three things can lead to a rise in the labor supply. So let's take a look at what happens when labor supply increases. Okay, let's come back to this diagram. Let me just erase this. Now, labor supply is increasing. So what that means is that the supply curve is going to shift to the right. Okay, so this is what happens. Supply curve shifts to the right. As a result, we have a new equilibrium. So of course, number of workers, or actually at least the labor hours supplied to the market, has gone up. So at the new equilibrium, labor hours will be higher. Since we have more workers vying for the same number of jobs, wage rate is going to go down. But what's more important is right here. So if we extend this, that's not a very accurate diagram, but doesn't matter. This is where we end up in. Okay, so of course over here we are at L1, hours worked have gone up, and since we are hiring more people now, as we would expect, potential GDP has gone up. That is great. Okay, but the problem is, the good things are that we are hiring more people, that's good, and our potential GDP is higher. So these are the good things. The problem here is, let me write this down. So concerns with rising labor supply is that, not standard of living, sorry, average standard of living falls. Okay, I'm going to explain why, but it might be interesting for you guys to sort of pause the video right now and try to figure out from this diagram, take a look at this diagram and try to figure out exactly why a rise in labor supply will lead to a fall in standard of living. Now, the obvious answer is, of course, that wage rate has fallen, real wage has fallen, so people are earning less money, so obviously that's going to reduce the standard of living. That's one reason, but there is also a second reason. Okay, so if you want to, do pause the video and try to figure out, spend 5 minutes, 10 minutes trying to figure out why this might happen before I explain. So one is, of course, fall in real wage. That's obvious. Number two is average productivity falls. So to understand what we mean by average productivity falling, remember how we described the production function. This example, for example, when 5 people were applying for a job but only 3 people could get a job. So what did the company do? They hired the most productive worker first, right? So let's work out a numerical example. Okay, so there are 5 people in the economy. Okay, so let's call it person 1, person 2, person 3, person 4, person 5. So this is the number of workers, and this is a ranked list. Okay, so person 1 is the most productive, person 2 is the second productive, and so on until we reach person 5, who is the least productive. So if these people were working, what output will they give us? Since person 1 is most productive, suppose he will give us 10 units of output, and person 2 will give us 9, 8, 7, and person 5 will give us 6 units of output. Okay, so when we're employing people, of course we are going to start with the best resources, right? That was the explanation we wrote down up here. The best resources will be used first. So when the economy is trying to figure out who to hire out of these 5 people, we are going to start with person 1, then we will move on to person 2, then to 3, and so on until we hire 5 people. Okay. So let's also construct a column and call it total output. Okay, so when we just have person 1, our total output is 10. When we are hiring both person 1 and person 2, our total output is 10 plus 9, 19. When we're hiring the first 3 people, our output is 27, then it goes to 34, and then it goes to 40. So when we are hiring all 5 workers, our output is 40. So first of all, of course, our total output is increasing. Each worker gives us a positive output. But of course, the concern is that the amount of output we get from each worker is falling. So let's calculate from total output, let's calculate average output. Okay, so when we have 1 worker, is giving us 10 units of output, so average is 10. It's fine. When we arrive here, we have 2 workers, and together they're giving us 19 units of output. So our average is 19 divided by 2, so that gives us 9.5. When we hire 3 workers, 3 of them together gives us 27 units of output. So on average, each person is giving us 27 divided by 3, 9 units. And if we keep going down, we see this will be 8.5 and this will be 8. So what does that mean? See, when we had 1 worker, on average, each worker was giving us 10 units. This was our productivity. Each worker is giving us 10 units of output. When we hire 5 workers, each worker, on average, each worker gives us 8 units. So this exhibits a fall in productivity. And this is what I mean by this. When labor supply rise and the supply curve shifts to the left, one problem is obvious, is that the wage rate is going to fall. Fine. The second problem also, because the production function is increasing at a decreasing rate, we are going to see that our productivity is falling, and addition of each worker is giving us less and less and less output. So even though this is growth, of course this is growth because our potential GDP has gone up, right? It used to be here, then labor supply increased and it went up here. So real GDP has gone up. So of course this is growth, and growth is always good, but this isn't. There are problems with this dynamics as well. People are earning less money, and our average productivity has gone up. So number one, not so great. What's the second way in which uh, economic growth can take place? The second reason is technology, okay, or rather let's call it uh, rise in, in labor productivity. Now, how might labor productivity rise? One can be education, for example. So if you have a more educated education, training, experience. So if you have a more experienced workforce, or a workforce with better training, better education, you'd expect them to give you more output. There will be better workers. So this is one way in which labor productivity can increase. Another can be health. If you have a more healthy workforce, you'd expect them to give you better outputs, or higher outputs at least. Third way can be technology. So if you can give technology or capital, so if you can give more or better technology equipments to your workers, then they will also be more productive. So a person was using hammer to break bricks. It's a very difficult work. It's not a very efficient way of working. Then you buy a jackhammer, and instead of a hammer, your worker starts using a jackhammer, and that makes him more productive. It's the same worker, but he's going to give you better outputs, higher outputs. So, I mean, there are many different ways in which labor productivity can increase, but by labor productivity, rise in labor productivity, what I mean to say is that the same worker can now give us more output. Okay, I'll just write it down. A rise in labor productivity implies that the same worker can now give us more or better or both output. So this is the definition of labor productivity. And of course, you guys understand that the opposite is also true. A fall in labor productivity would mean that the same worker gives us less or inferior quality of output. Okay, so let's look at this graphically. What happens when there is a rise in labor productivity? This is interesting. So we have labor hours here. We have what do we have? Real GDP here. So if we draw the production function here, okay. So here's what a rise in labor productivity means. Initially, if we are hiring this many workers, this is how much our potential GDP is. But now, because of a rise in labor productivity, we've talked about some of the causes of labor productivity. Because of a rise in labor productivity, we may continue to hire the same number of workers, but they are now going to give me more output. So this goes up y1. So the same number of workers are giving me more output. So I'm going to draw the new production function like this. So what has happened is our production function has shifted up. This is an example of a rise in productivity. This is what happens. So let's draw the demand and supply diagram underneath as well, and let's see what's happening here. Labor hours, and we have real wage. Let's bring this down. So this is what the equilibrium will be. So this is labor demand, and this is labor supply. And of course, we have the real wage here. Okay, so far so good. All right. Now the story isn't over. Now you can see that this already is a better position, because what has happened in step one, let's write this down. When productivity increase, what happens? Step one is that for the same input, in this example that is labor, we get more output. In this case, that's our potential GDP. But another thing is going to happen, okay? I think of the employers, okay, the people who gives jobs. These are different companies, different factories, and so on and so forth. What they have noticed is that the quality of workers in the country has gone up, be it through education or training or technology or capital augmentation, whatever. The quality of workers have gone up. What will they do? What will you do if you were running a business and you were hiring workers for a certain wage rate, and then you notice that suddenly workers are better? What would you do? You would want to hire more of them because these are better workers. Labor demand would increase. Labor demand shifts to the right. This is the second thing that happens, is that labor demand increases. Okay. Once that happens, let's see where we end up in. We have a new equilibrium. In this equilibrium, good things, we're hiring more people, so that's always good. Creating jobs in an economy is always a good thing. That's the first thing. Second of all, wage has gone up. Why not to Y1? So not only are we hiring more people, but these people are now earning a higher wage. Two good things. So let's write that down as well. So what this means is more jobs are created and real wage increases. That's the second thing. Story isn't over yet. What's the third thing that happens? Labor demand has gone up. As a result, we once again have to extend this. This is going to go up. This is where we would have been in the initial production function, but we have a new production function. So this is where we end up in, and real GDP, which was at this point, let's label them. Real GDP was at point A, then it moved to point B, now it moves to point C, and of course this is higher. y2. So the third thing that happens is potential GDP increases again.